When I was a kid, I liked to draw, like any kid. Markers, crayons, watercolors, or whatever goofy crap Crayola was pushing at the time. It was just fun to make something. Being good never crossed my mind. I would draw monsters, cars, and, shapes in general, I guess, but I eventually stopped. The gap between what I could picture in my head and what I could make was beginning to bother me. I saw what other kids my age could do, and it felt like it wasn't something that called out to me. It was just something I did. It wasn't something I thought about doing. It was around this time in grade school I was finally able to get into something I knew I'd be interested in. Music. Specifically, learning an instrument. If you would, take a guess. What instrument do you think someone as clearly full of themselves and attention-seeking as myself would play? Ask anyone that's taken a band class and I'm sure they'd guess right. I played trumpet all the way through high school, and I had a lot more fun with it. Which is funny because I feel like the way instruments are taught, the focus is more on being good. I was never good, but once again I didn't care. I didn't play trumpet to be the best, I played because I wanted to play the songs I knew. So, one measure at a time, I would sound out my favorite songs, and maybe throughout the course of a week of goofing off in free play, I could get a full riff. It felt really cool because when everyone else would practice, they would be trying to get whatever arrangement the whole band was doing to sound as good as they could. Meanwhile, I was off in a corner playing the worst rendition of a ska song from 2 decades ago you ever heard, and having the time of my life. I did stop playing trumpet too, at least in school, which is what kept me from getting distracted enough to drop it in the first place. I had other things I was beginning to take more of an interest in. I had taken a general interest in engineering, an interest my parents and school was very willing to light a fire under. And their encouragement led to a lot of things, but the one worth mentioning is my fascination with design. The design process, or how to identify a problem that we can build around, is a topic I will never tire of. Solving problems, even ones made up for fun, was the main way I expressed my creativity for a while. Admittedly, I focused more on the mechanical aspects of it in high school, the parts that will lead you to an engineering college. And for all of my love of design, the why behind all the best ideas we've had, it was never a focus when it came to higher education, so I used it less. I went a long time just waiting until I could exercise the thing I really loved doing, and by the time I left college, it had been years since I had really done anything I was creatively passionate about. I hardly even noticed it had been so long. I never would have called myself a creative person, but I more or less always had some kind of creative outlet I was working on. I always needed that creativity, so when I found that it wasn't asked of me to use it, I had a hard time connecting to it. I was stuck like that for a long time, and I think a lot of people are stuck like that too. Either they follow a similar path I did, where they lose that creative connection, or it was never nurtured in the first place. And spoilers on this creative work you're watching, but I did get unstuck. A few things got that spark going, but I want to talk about the one that's the most fascinating to me. I'm Rye Royal, and I want to talk about how games make you make art. So, why are games the thing that got me unstuck? All art mediums have the capability to say something about making art. For as long as there have been paintings on cave walls or scripts carved to stone, there has been art about the act of making art. Artists make art that reflects or resembles their own experiences, and, unsurprisingly, a lot of those experiences are about making art. Art is a great way to process and capture our experiences outside of our memory. Not only does it create a stronger bond to the past, but it also allows us to share these experiences. And as something of an outsider to the creative world, the experience of an artist is an interesting thing. The concept of these creative minds being stuck in slumps or lacking the ability to manifest their own ideas in their medium makes the whole thing feel a lot more approachable. But maybe that's just the impact any experience has when interpreted through art. Well, then you can also think of art as an industry. Art about art can let us see sides of the process usually restricted to the artists themselves. We can see the intricacies of a piece typically invisible to an untrained audience. We can see the challenges of making a piece seen at all. Art can show us the struggles an industry puts on creativity and how creatives push against these bounds to make something anyway. The act of an artist expressing their feelings about their art can be an incredibly moving and inspiring thing. I'm sure plenty of people got into making art after seeing something like that and wanted to chase that feeling on their own. However, despite taking in all this wonderful, inspiring art, nothing moved me to make my own until I found games about making art. To those of you who have always been creatively inclined, I bet you're wondering why even make a fuss about something getting you to create at all. Inspiration can come from anywhere. To come from another piece of art, even a game, is not such a strange concept. But to you, I say, you don't understand. Inspiration isn't even what I want to talk about. If you don't think of yourself as a creative person, art can seem like a thing only done by artists. And an artist is something that you have always been. I watched plays, read books, and listened to music all about the act of making art, and the fallacy of that idea never really hit me. The fallacy, of course, being that making art is what makes an artist, and anyone can start making art at any point in their lives. I think the reason this only clicked when I started to play games about art is because you have to be the driving force of the experience. It's pretty easy to take in other forms of media about art and think, wow, beautiful, moving. It couldn't be me, though. Only games can reach across the veil, grab you by the wrist, and say, yes, it can. If it has not been made obvious by now, I am incredibly stubborn, and for some reason just refuse to accept that I could produce anything creative. It was a whole journey to get me to stop thinking that way, and I didn't change until I was forced to engage with the concept by games. Now, let's pull back and look at how games got me to think about making art. To start, I think it's worth mentioning that there are games about the process and the industry made all the time. Games love to talk about games. That's essentially the definition of meta, talking about talking. Sometimes it's just a line or two, but whole games have been made to dissect and critique the industry at large, and if there is one industry that needs it, it's the games industry. But games are a collaborative art. It's one thing to tell the audience of a piece about your bad experiences through your art, it's another to expect someone to play through them. And with games, it's all about the play. Games have to factor in that player element. There is no greater element to games than the power of player choice. Is what I would say if I hadn't played the Stanley Parable. The Stanley Parable will stand out more and more as we talk about the other games I have in mind because it doesn't really posit itself being about art or creativity outright, but it is undeniably a game about games. For someone on the periphery of creativity like I was, the Stanley Parable is the perfect first step into thinking about art. It's a little unassuming, looking and playing just like most Source Engine games of its era. A comfortable, familiar thing, and it's not like there is a big twist here. What you see is what you get. Instead, the Stanley Parable focuses on narrative and player choice, or maybe the lack thereof. The Stanley Parable is a game all about the freedom of player choice. How games as an interactive medium are all about the expressiveness of the player. And it takes this concept that surrounds the gaming medium as a whole and slams it into reality. Because in reality, you can only feel so free when every possible choice you can make has a pre-recorded line of dialogue that goes with it.
And so he detoured through the maintenance section, walked straight ahead to the opposite door, and got back on track. But Stanley didn't want to go back to the office. He wanted to wander about and get even further off track. So now in order to get back, he needed to go, from here it's, left.
The Stanley Parable is important to consider here because it peels back the artifice and lets you look behind the curtains, but not by showing you code or unfinished assets. It shows you the tricks games as an art form use to engage the player, and shows exactly how a game functions with or without their investment and input. In terms of the breakdown between creator and audience, when it comes to games, it doesn't get much more meta than the Stanley Parable. Unless you want to talk about The Beginner's Guide, and I don't. That game is the final boss of games writing and media literacy, and I'm not gonna go there today. No, I mean it. I'm not doing this. We're moving on. Meta is great for getting you thinking about games, but it's not exactly forcing creativity out of the player. When it comes to actually being able to make something, games can cover a lot of the other mediums. The way that a lot of games go about that is by making a creation tool and gamifying it. What's ironic is that the medium that gets the least attention in this regard is games. Games that let you make games are kind of rare in the grand scheme of things. Games like Dreams and Game Builder Garage let you make games, but they are more like tools than actual games themselves. The only real gamification they have is making tutorials a bit more natural and the systems a lot more accessible. Games are a complicated medium, and it's not really possible to trick someone into making one. At least not from scratch. I'd argue the better way games can invoke creativity like this is by giving players fully functional games with systems and letting the players put the pieces together themselves. On a large scale, you have games like Garry's Mod that basically just hands you some sturdy FPS controls, a robust physics system, and lets you go nuts. From there, it is up to the players to make the game. It's all implicit unless you have the skills to mod it otherwise. It can be a classic deathmatch, or it can be Jenga. And honestly, I could slot Minecraft into any of my points because of its creative flexibility, but it's not exactly tricking anyone into being creative. You don't have to place a single block in that game to have meaningful interactions. But if you have the impetus, I don't think there is a more artistically expressive game out there. For my money though, it's the more focused tools that can more easily reach people creatively. Focus tools like level editors. Systems and goals are already baked in, but allowing players to define the space in which the game takes place is still a powerful thing. You may not know this, but I have actually briefly touched on a certain level-making game before. Super Mario Maker! Yes, Mario Maker. I still have more to say about this damn game. Mario Maker, and many other level makers like it, are great ways to pull creativity out of people. They are robust and complex enough to facilitate a lot of possibilities, but defined enough to still come off as approachable. It's also not a blind box creatively. Most of the time when playing a level that is fun or clever, the audience playing it can understand how the pieces were used. It's all about how those pieces are assembled, not how the pieces themselves work. Level builders are about as close as games can get to being tools while still maintaining their status as a game. Not only are they often built upon another game's framework, but there are now just lots of levels to play with no building required. Many people play Mario Maker without building a single level. The spectrum of tools to make art in a certain medium to game about an art medium is a hard one to navigate. Due to their complexity, games about making games pretty unilaterally fall closer to the tool side. To get a better understanding of this spectrum, let's look at a medium that has rock-solid entries on both sides. Music. At my most musical, I was never really interested in making my own songs, so I'm not terribly well versed in games that let you compose music. There are a lot of music tools in games, and I would consider anything that has a playable instrument that lets you choose the notes in this category. But for more complex examples that have been around for quite a while, Mario Paint from 1992 had a pretty robust music editor, and I know I'm guilty of watching songs transcribed to Minecraft music block contraptions. All that to say, the tool side of the spectrum is pretty self-evident. Music can be made in a game, but a tool can only say so much on its own. On the other end are games more explicitly about the medium of music rather than facilitating its creation. The complete control and freedom of a tool is taken away, but more can be said about the music itself by doing so. We can fit a lot of games in this side of the spectrum if we include any game that has its music take a more active role in its gameplay. I think even games that just have some action synced up with the music have a place here. They are trying to get you to form an active engagement with the music by making something you do make music. But if we want to focus on games that are more wholly focused on the musical elements, rhythm games are a pretty good endpoint for this spectrum. The players are not authoring the music themselves, but they aren't just listening to it either. It's a constant effort to stay in sync with the music. That requires a much deeper understanding of the music and still makes the player feel like a key component. I think a lot of music games pretty consistently fall in one of these categories, but I wouldn't have made it a spectrum if I didn't have a game I thought sat comfortably in the middle. That game also just so happens to be objectively the best music game ever created. I swear I can back this up. Wii Music is a 2008 Wii game that is famous for making you look like this. Look, the Wii is fondly remembered for a lot of reasons, but the waggle-based gameplay is rarely one of them. By this time, people were already getting sick of waving their arms around to do what a simple button press was more than capable of. But did this game get unfairly judged? No, not really. This is absolutely ridiculous looking, but I loved it anyway. And although the waggle gameplay is what people are going to remember from this game, it's not hard to see why it was done from a gameplay perspective. It's trying to tap into that most basic of human instincts: air guitar. Is it precise to wave your hands to play a drum that isn't there, or finger a flute that you can't feel? No, but it is intuitive. Anyone that has seen an instrument being played could probably guess the controls of it in Wii Music. It's a game of pantomimes, and in that way it really fits in with the Wii's whole philosophy following Wii Sports, making playing seem natural, letting the rest follow. When it comes to the actual playing, Wii Music is, again, pretty simple, just requiring an action to line up with the note being played. It's Guitar Hero in essence, with about 1/5 the execution required. Guitar Hero is not the earliest representation of this style of rhythm game, but it is the most apt comparison for anything coming out in 2008. It was the thing to beat. However, I would still classify it as a rhythm game, putting it far closer to this end of the spectrum. So, if Wii Music is just a simplified version of that, why am I talking about it as an example of the mid-spectrum? Because, no matter how you feel about the quality of Wii Music as a rhythm game, I would argue it's still one of the best music games. What's the difference? Instrumentation. The simplicity of play and the controls are what made getting into the music easy. The instrumentation is how the game enables the player to take the next step. Being able to change up the instruments in all the parts of the ensemble is what gave this game legs for me. Now, it wasn't just about being able to play the song, it was about playing it my way. Not just the instruments, but the subtle nuance in the gameplay itself. How many other rhythm games allow you to control the volume of your instrument? Yeah, at any time you can raise or lower the volume just by changing your movement a little bit. Now, not only can any roll be any instrument, it can also get however much emphasis you want if you coordinate your play. You can push the melody way down if you think the bass or percussion should be the driving force of a measure, or if you want, you could just make the melody stop entirely. You are the ranking system for this game, so just do what you want. Wii Music is clearly a weaker outlier in the rhythm game genre it was so closely following, but it instead embraces a lot more aspect of the medium of music as a whole, and puts a lot more tools in the player's hands than most games like it, and I'll always love it for that. When it comes to art mediums that are being embraced by video games, the one having its moment right now is photography. Photography is not a new concept to gaming, but it's enjoying something of a renaissance. Personally, I attribute this to Pokemon Snap. It was such a good idea that came at exactly the right time, and although not the earliest entry in the most recent trend, I do think it's significant that its direct sequel came out in the past few years. New Snap is similar enough to the original to draw comparison, but updated enough to see how the trends in photography games have gone. Snap is primarily focused in on framing and timing. Photography is about capturing moments, so try and find the interesting ones. And once you do, make sure that it is the main focus of your photo. Which basically just comes down to what is centered. These lessons may seem obvious to a generation that grew up with a camera on their person at all times, but it's a much more dramatic lesson for a newcomer to the medium, which a lot more people were in 1999. It's also a lesson that comes quite naturally in the world of Pokemon. By giving the whole game a zoologist twist, it makes finding subjects to photograph trivial. It's in the name. Pokemon. Is it a new Pokemon? Then that would probably make a good photo. Is it doing something you haven't seen it do before? Good photo op. Is it in a place it's not normally seen in? You get the idea. It's a formula that works really well without having to really explain why it works. The subjects are so interesting and colorful that the intent is just natural. When adapting this 20-year-old formula, the biggest changes were primarily in fidelity and connectivity, things that simply couldn't have been done there in an N64 release. It's actually such a fun and strong formula, I think it kind of stunted the genre for a while. A lot of photography games simply fill a virtual world with interesting subjects and ask you to find them. And I don't mean to diminish that. It's a really fun formula, and slight tweaks can make a big difference. Toem turned the concept into a diorama-esque adventure game that combines the photo taking with short quest lines and I Spy elements. Eastward makes the subjects a lot more vague so that the interpretation is a bigger part of the game, and it throws RPG and survival elements on top of it. However, the game that took the deepest approach to a photography game is probably Umurangi Generation still follows a similar formula by filling a virtual world with interesting subjects, but the camera has a much more physical presence. Not only will certain things need to be found and photographed, certain lenses and framings will be required to do so. It's definitely the photography game that asks the most from the player from a technical perspective. Which is funny because of all the requirements in place, only about 20% of the actual tools at your disposal are used. By the time everything is unlocked, it feels like you are operating a highly adaptive piece of technology, if you actually know how to use it. It has the most respect for the actual act of photography, but it feels off to call this game about photography. Photography is important, and it is how you interact and experience this world, but Umurangi Generation has far bigger things on its mind. But for my money, the biggest impact in this recent interest has not been in so-called photography games. It's in a lot of games, arguably any game, that lets you take a screenshot. Photo modes are an amazing feature in any game that has them, and even when they aren't fully fleshed out modes, any game that allows the user to hide or reduce UI elements has a similar spirit. As games began to tailor experiences more unique to us, we found more moments in these games we wanted to capture, and the ever-increasing visual quality of these games didn't hurt that ambition either. That desire is one neatly filled by photography. Digital photography of all digital worlds motivated purely by what we think looks neat. It's such a common feeling now that every major console manufacturer has a dedicated button on the controller for taking screenshots at a moment's notice. Beyond screenshots, full-on photo modes are being embraced more and more, to the point where games are patching them in at fan request. Eurothug 2K made a much more in-depth piece about the high-level technique and growing interest in virtual photography that I'll link below. There really is a budding art form lying in the digital worlds of these games. To my point though, it is just nice to see that games are becoming more aware of the non-game ways we like to interact with them. Games are acutely aware of what we see in them, and so much work is put in to make these moments stand out, even in an interactive medium. To be able to take even greater control of the camera and game world to capture our own moments is great. But for as great as photo modes are, sometimes just knowing a screenshot is a button press away is enough. You may be able to make small games in Game Builder Garage, use a new instrumentation in Wii Music, or take a perfectly framed photo in Snap, but in the end these are still facsimiles. You still make art with all of them, but job one for a lot of these games is to get the simulation of creation as close as possible to the real medium. With the focus shifted, it becomes harder to say something is about the act of creation. There's another layer of abstraction to get past. I know I didn't really use a camera in Toem. I doubt any results there would reflect a real-world attempt. That is less the case when it comes to drawing. There are tons of drawing games out there. A lot are, again, more like tools with some gamification on top, while others simply add drawing as a component of customization and expression. And this is where I reveal a bit of an embarrassing fact. I made all of the art in this museum. Recently. I am an aspiring artist, and I can't draw. 3D has always been my medium of choice, but that doesn't mean drawing is irrelevant. It basically just means I'm skipping a step. I can still manage, though. I made this hat. It's pretty lumpy, huh? I've thought about buckling down and really learning, but every time I think I could try to learn how to draw. Or I can finally learn what the compositor tab does. Look at it up there. Surely I should already know what that does. Point is, drawing doesn't come naturally, and getting me to do it is like pulling teeth. But it was a drawing game that got me back into art at all, including making videos. Games about drawing can take a much more direct approach to the medium at hand. There is no facsimile, it is just drawing. As a result, they can dive into the mindset behind the art a lot easier. Which is to say, there are a lot more drawing games about the process of making art than there are for a lot of other mediums. Art School and the Passepartout games are some of the standout examples I've played. They definitely have something to say about the act of creation, especially drawing. Only thing is, they are aware that the main input method most players will be using is the mouse, so they approach the topic with a more cheeky tone. It was definitely the right choice, especially for someone that can't really draw like myself. Anything to lower my guard a bit and allow for more error on my behalf. It's hard to be too hard on yourself when you're making art for Muppets, using what basically amounts to MS Paint. Passepartout, Starving Artist, is probably the most basic of these games. Very little direction is given, and not much can be done outside of drawing and selling those drawings. There is progression, but it feels arbitrary and takes quite a while. However, I feel that is more or less exactly how the game wanted to come across. As a starving artist, it makes sense you are constantly working only to barely keep your head above water, and the judgment and progression feels arbitrary because it more or less is. I'm sure there are parameters to meet in the background, but if we have trouble evaluating the merit of art amongst other humans, how can a computer possibly assign the same judgment? The loop the game has implemented is an interesting statement on the strain the art world can put on an artist, but I couldn't stick with it. Of course I couldn't. I was already struggling to produce any art, but the volume needed to satisfy the loop was too much. For me, the first Passepartout game is a perfect burnout simulator. What's funny is, I feel the second game is less likely to trigger this kind of creative burnout, but is still just as stressful. The first game is very focused on unbound creativity. You could paint whatever you wanted, and it was just as likely to fail as it was to succeed. In contrast, the second game is much more directed and exponentially expanded. The level of interaction now spans an entire adventure game style map with quests and items and an inventory. You simply have a lot more to do, and in addition to being able to sell whatever you paint, you can now take on jobs. It is still incredibly hard to say on which merits the program can judge you for these jobs, but for someone like me, it was all about the direction. Simply having a goal in mind helped my creative process a lot. Finishing these jobs felt satisfying, and now that the progression was a lot more tangible, I felt compelled to keep going. Thematically speaking, the two games cover the same grounds. I think the first game handles the struggles of a starving artist more succinctly, but the second game got me creating and feeling more comfortable doing it. So, which is the better art game? The one that better represents the point it's trying to make about the medium? Or the one that better places you in the role because you are actually making the art? Well, in the end, neither were especially impactful for me. As I implied, the second game was too much for me as well. It does still have that problem of burnout, but is now also overstimulating. There is too much to do. The freedom the game provides means the more you do, the more things open up to you. But the more things open up to you, the more you have to do. At a certain point, I opened up so many different options and quests that the jobs on offer did start feeling like jobs, even if I couldn't really fail. I think there is a good middle ground for the approaches these games take, and I found it in Art School. Art School is another very simple drawing game on its face. You get prompts by the AI director of the school and are let loose in this vivid digital world to wander about and draw your submission. The drawing is even more basic than that of the first Passepartout game, but you can unlock a few more options by finding them in the world. And that's the only practical application for the world. No quests or inventories or NPCs like the second Passepartout game. There's no limit on your exploration either. If you wanted to, you could collect all of your tools the first time you enter this world and never really interact with it again. But no one's going to do that, because it's not about the exploration and collecting. This strange, colorful place is here to be observed. It's here to inspire your work and evoke new thoughts and emotions. A lot of the prompts ask you to express vague feelings and concepts, so the interesting, simple shapes and profiles of the environment are great for getting you thinking. However, despite being the only game to give you solid data about the metrics on which you're judged, it's the most blatantly arbitrary. What you draw doesn't matter. The prompts don't matter, and the metatext around the whole game doesn't matter. I imagine this could be a bit deflating to some people, but the game is already so goofy, I found it to be perfectly in line with the tone I was going for. The drawings being without point isn't meant to be degrading, it's meant to be liberating. It's inviting you not to take this seriously, just make the art you want to. Treating it all like a joke got me to engage more. Levity is the enemy of anxiety, after all. I didn't even get upset when the game would throw a random failure my way. I knew it was just a joke at my expense. The only misstep with this approach is, if everything is a joke, then it's hard to take anything to heart. I appreciate that this game got me to make something, but it didn't inform my relationship with my art. It had all the depth of a game of Pictionary, reinforced by the fact that by the end I was incorporating text and basically just making memes. I was just trying to make myself laugh, but I did have a thought process for every piece. In fact, I invite you to click over to my Patreon, patreon.com/ryroyal, where I have a commentary going over every drawing I did for this video. Is it pretentious to give commentary to art like this? How can I justify a piece like this? I don't know, but come watch me try. A full half of what I make is exclusive to Patreon, so at some point you're just missing out. All these games have something to say about making art, and some can even pull that act of creation out of its audience. But none of them made it stick for me. Chicory: A Colorful Tale is arguably the game that got me to start this channel and start creating again, because that's really it. This block I had after leaving school only really broke when I decided to make videos. I didn't want to make anything for the longest time because I was afraid of it not being good. The genius of Chicory and the other drawing games is that making something good is basically off the table. It's not like it's impossible to make anything that looks nice, but it's never going to match your expectations. Skipping ahead a bit, one of the longest side quests in this game tasks you with recreating some older pieces, only now, thanks to you, in color. But the originals look like this. Even for the absolute best artists out there, this task is impossible. Chicory's in-game canvas literally doesn't have a high enough resolution to capture fine details, or heck, even pretty obvious details. It's a messy, awkward, globular editor that will leave anything you make looking really off from how you meant it to, which is amazing. When I first came to this game, I was really only interested in the story and the concept. That concept being, what if you could play a Zelda game where the main form of interaction was MS Paint? In this game, you play as Fries, who wants to be the wielder of the brush that brings color to this world. There have been many wielders before, but Fries loves none more than the current wielder, Chicory. Each wielder has been a great artist, and Fries is not. They are the janitor for the wielder's tower. It's a cute, relatable setup to the story, but I wasn't sure it would work considering how little I planned on drawing. However, Fry's energy was just so infectious when they did get the brush a few minutes past the opening, I did crack a little. Okay, I may not be an artist, but they aren't either, so I guess I could put a little more effort into drawing than I initially thought I was going to. You can draw anywhere, and every screen has tons of interactable objects that will perfectly fill with color when you click on them. That's cute, I thought. It's like all those paint-by-numbers games included with old kids programs. Even the sky and ground can be completely colored in, but that was a bit too much for me. I was ready to get to the first big story beat of the game, but the surrounding screens of Luncheon all have quests that you can do, and because Fries was so excited about it, I did try my best to accommodate whatever coloring quest I could manage. The best one is here at the cafe. They wanted a t-shirt designed. This is the first time the game hands you a version of the editor. I was still trying to get on with the game, so I mustered up the most creativity I could spare for a seemingly innocuous task. It's a lazy design, and I knew it, but I didn't think much of it until I saw random NPCs walking around wearing my shirt. Seeing that made me want to put in even more effort. If I'll actually change the look of the world, I should probably try then. So I really dove in. The editor is less precise than drawing in PictoChat on the original DS was, so it's not like my lack of skill was really going to hinder the results that much, and the game was willing to work with me. It's easy to color in the big objects, so I'll just start with those. After visiting Supper Woods, featuring the best song in the game, you reach this dark tree, the only kind that can't be colored in the game. Inside you fight something using the power of Kid Picks and get yet another genius tool for goading creativity. The Splatoon Swim. Now every drop of paint is a high-speed rail for your movement. Swimming around is not only fun and fast, but lets you get into areas you couldn't before and find secrets. So yes, if you haven't realized now what my thesis is, I'm trying to argue that one of the best pieces of media about making art is a fancy coloring book. I'm sure I'm painting myself as a pretty stubborn individual, but I mean it when I say I needed all the tricks this game mustered to get me to engage like this at all. I was so sure I couldn't create that I didn't even trust I could make a screen with a 4-color palette look appealing. So yeah, getting me back to where I was in 3rd grade creatively was a pretty big step. But it was just one step. I was ready to meet the game on its own terms now. You want me to design a color scheme for each area? I'll do it. You want me to draw Chicory a portrait? Great, there it is. It's awful. How about a sign for your donut shop? Well, congratulations on your Donut Wolf crossover. I knew it was bad, but the game didn't expect any more from me. In fact, it agrees with me that it is bad. If it wasn't obvious, this game, and really all the games I've mentioned, cannot make a creative judgment on the art you make with them. Some will try to say something based on conditions they find in the art, but most just say something generally positive and move on. Chicory is the only one that has a few moments that actually acknowledge your work as genuinely bad, and that is honestly kind of refreshing. It's a really positive game in general, but the point isn't that what you make is always good. More than anything, Chicory is fixated on making art seem approachable. The various editors and the entire overworld try to make the actual pen and paper aspect of creating feel easy and intuitive. You can express yourself, but you can't get overwhelmed if you try. It's all just too simplistic for that. For those reasons, it also means that the game doesn't really talk about technique. Even with all the drawing you do in this game, I don't think you'd get much better at drawing by playing it. Talking about technique doesn't serve the goal, getting you to make art. Execution is only half the puzzle, the other is mentality. The tricks I mentioned to get someone like me to start were great, but the mentality for being creative goes beyond the first step. For a game about making art, it seems interested in all the reasons why someone wouldn't. Fry's reasons spoke to me. They were someone who never really thought themselves capable or comparable. It took the smallest steps to even get me to consider the option. But there are plenty of other characters. Chicory is suffering from the high expectations she believes others have of her and the ones that she puts on herself. Radish is sick of making art only she sees. Clementine feels the need to switch mediums, and Cardamom just doesn't have any more to say. Doubt, confidence, exhaustion, stress, and fear are all common parts of the process. Art is so many people's escape. That gives off the impression that the whole process is seamless. If people have the ideas, it's just a matter of putting them to a medium. A lot of stories about making art have such a dramatic lean to them. It's either a joyous, transcendental process or a grueling, almost violent struggle to get a piece to come to fruition. Chicory gives these dramatic feelings something they needed for the newcomer like me. Mundanity. These feelings come and go. The process doesn't have to be driven by just one feeling. Having negative feelings about your art doesn't invalidate it or your ability to make something else. Those are the games that brought me back to art. I'm really glad I got back into creating because it felt like something was missing for a long time. I've been wanting to talk about a lot of these games for a while, but I didn't know why until I started thinking about it through the lens of art. Thinking about why I create made me realize all the little lessons I took from these games, so I'm glad I got to put that into words. However, the games weren't what made me think about this topic. Why create was the original question for me, and if you are familiar with the conversation surrounding 2024, you probably know why. So, I've been kind of stressed out about AI. I try to avoid topical conversation. I want what I say to be as relevant for as long as possible. However, this is an exception. I hope my fears are no longer relevant in the near future, but for now, I just want to process them. AI is a term that applies to a lot of technology, tons of which is unambiguously good. But in early 2023, generative AI began rapidly gaining relevancy. It was mostly adopted as a casual distraction, an internet phase. Now we are seeing widespread adoption by companies, advertisers, and private devotees. Generative AI has a lot of problems, and to give the broadest possible explanation, it's endangering the careers and livelihoods of countless artists and writers by stealing their work, forcing it through black box algorithms to spit out an inferior yet often passable product. I've just spent a good amount of time expounding on my lower quality art, so I'm not really in a good position to judge, but it doesn't matter. I'm not giving you examples because it's not worth doing so. I'm not talking about the art itself. I only care about how it was made, and how it was made is actively hurting us. To call the art itself bad is missing the point. I actually have a couple confessions, though. The first of which is more of a story. I actually used AI to write the troll history video. For one line. It was a joke. I was talking about how overanalyzed the level design of 1-1 is, so I wanted a homogeneous, paper-thin analysis to make fun of how it would sound. I wanted a bad mashup of every 1-1 analysis ever made, and bad mashups are basically all that ChatGPT does. If the joke was to have a stark drop-off in writing styles, then it was adequate, but I found the better way to make it funny was to drown out the script entirely with corrupted music and cheap-cheeps. First, a quick analysis of 1-1. One of the defining features of 1-1 was its use of verticality, with Mario having to jump up and down. It was so inconsequential, it's hard to say I regret it, but I never put much stock in it to begin with. It was an edgy joke, something that was funny purely because I could get away with it. I would not do it again, but the fact that I ever did leads me to my next confession, which is that I can understand why some people want to embrace generative art. I cannot deny the idea of conjuring a whole piece based off of a small piece I can contribute is enticing. I have a lot of little ideas I would love to have art of someday. Having that at a push of a button is tempting on paper, but only on paper. It's just not worth it in the end. Not for nothing, but I don't want to steal other people's work. You will never convince me that AIs can produce what they do with 100% permitted art. AI is for people with no real desire to create. And, that on its own is fine. Do you like seeing incredible things and just experiencing art without contributing to it? Because that's fine. Consumer gets tossed around like a dirty word these days for a lot of reasons, but if just being around art makes you happy, then you shouldn't feel the pressure to create just to have the creation. I promise there is someone out there that would like nothing more than to have you appreciate their art. But if that urge to create is in you, you have to believe me that AI is not going to satisfy. If I've demonstrated nothing else here, it's that I doubt you could be worse off than I was. I understand being petrified by the idea of taking up art after so consistently telling myself I couldn't. I know how frustrating it can be when something doesn't quite turn out exactly how you intended it to, but what these games, and later actually starting, taught me is that the art isn't the final product. It's also everything that led to it. I don't place the vertices on the right spot on the first try. I have to play with them, and even then, it's still not always how I pictured it. But if I didn't try at all, I never would have gotten something that I did like. The art is in the doing. I've been inspired by a lot of things over the years. So many tearful stories about artists making art. I never thought I'd be one, until games took me by the hand and made me do it myself. Trust me when I say that none of us really know what we're doing, but deep down we know it's about the doing. Good or bad, as long as you're the one making it. I'll see you in the next one.